Grace Whitfield felt the ground shift under her feet before she understood why. One moment she was standing at the edge of the coronation hall, holding a tray she was never supposed to be holding, filling in for a servant who had fainted from the heat. The next moment, every candle in the room seemed to lean toward her at once, and the air turned heavy, like the whole building had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it out. She dropped the tray. Nobody noticed the sound of it hitting the floor. Every eye in the room had already turned to her. At the front of the hall, on twin thrones carved from the same pale stone, sat the two men who ruled the kingdom of Ashford, Nathan and Gabriel, brothers born minutes apart, crowned the same day, ruling as one voice in two bodies. Grace had heard their names her whole life, the way people hear the names of mountains, something large and far away, and none of her business. Until now. Both men rose from their thrones at the same time. Their expressions were nothing alike. Nathan's jaw tightened, calm turning to stone. Gabriel's eyes went wide, then soft, then something close to panic. "Someone find out who she is," Nathan said, his voice steady in the way of a man used to being obeyed. "Someone find out if she's all right," Gabriel said at the same moment, already moving down the steps. Grace took a step backward and hit the wall. It didn't help. The pull she felt wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from inside her chest, and it was pulling in two directions at once, toward both men, equally, like her heart had been split down the middle without asking permission. She had heard of the bond before. Everyone had. A fated mate was supposed to be rare, a single thread connecting two people across an entire lifetime. She had never heard of it splitting in half. Gabriel reached her first. He didn't touch her, though his hand hovered near her elbow like he wanted to. Up close he looked younger than his reputation, kind in a way that seemed to embarrass him. "You're shaking," he said quietly. "I'm fine," Grace said, in the automatic voice of someone who has said that sentence 1,000 times without meaning it. Nathan arrived a breath later, and where Gabriel had asked, Nathan simply looked. He studied her the way he might study a map of unfamiliar territory, searching for the parts that didn't make sense yet. "What's your name?" he asked. "Grace." "Grace what?" "Whitfield." He said nothing else, but something behind his eyes shifted, filed her name away like a fact he intended to use later. The hall had gone completely silent. Hundreds of guests, advisors and pack leaders stood frozen, watching two kings and a servant girl stand in a triangle none of them understood. Somewhere near the back, an old woman in gray robes pushed through the crowd, moving faster than her age should have allowed. "Impossible," the woman muttered, though her voice carried in the silence. "A split bond. I have not seen this in 60 years. "What does that mean?" Gabriel asked, not looking away from Grace. The old woman, who Grace would later learn was named Winifred, the keeper of the old records, folded her hands together like she was praying for patience. "It means the fates have made a mistake, or they have made a choice none of us are ready to understand." Grace's mouth went dry. "I don't understand any of this." "Neither do we," Nathan said. It was the first honest thing he had said since he arrived, and something in his tone made it land harder than anything else. The crowd began to murmur, a low wave of sound rolling from the front of the hall to the back. Questions passed from mouth to mouth faster than any answer could catch them. A split bond meant no clear heir. A split bond meant no clear queen. A split bond meant the two kings who had ruled together in perfect balance their entire lives now stood on opposite sides of something neither of them could share. Gabriel finally touched her elbow, just enough to steady her. The moment his skin met hers, Grace felt the pull settle slightly, like a rope going taut instead of thrashing. She gasped without meaning to. Nathan noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. "Let her breathe, Gabriel," he said, and though his voice stayed calm, there was an edge underneath it that hadn't been there a minute ago. "I'm not hurting her. I didn't say you were." Grace looked between them, and for the first time she understood, in a small and frightening way, that the crown was never going to be the hardest part of this. The hardest part was standing between two men who loved each other as brothers and were about to learn what it felt like to want the exact same thing. Winifred stepped closer, studying Grace like she was a page from a book that had been missing for decades. "Bring her to the West Chamber," she said. "Both of you. Now, before the whole court decides they understand something they don't." The walk to the West Chamber felt longer than it should have. Grace kept her eyes forward, aware of Nathan on her left and Gabriel on her right, aware of the careful, deliberate distance each of them kept from touching her again, like they had silently agreed not to repeat what had just happened until they knew what it meant. The West Chamber was a round room at the top of a narrow stair, built, Grace would learn later, for exactly one throne. It had never been used for two kings and a servant girl standing in a triangle of silence. Winifred closed the door behind them and turned to face all three at once. "I will not pretend I have easy answers," she said. "What I can tell you is this. The old records speak of split bonds only a handful of times in the history of this kingdom, and every time they came before something the kingdom needed to survive. A war, a famine, a choice that could not be made by one heart alone." "Are you saying the fates did this on purpose?" Gabriel asked. "I am saying the fates rarely do anything by accident." Nathan crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on Grace like she was the only stable object in a room that had suddenly turned unfamiliar. "And what happens to her? What happens to us?" Winifred's expression did not soften. "That, Your Majesty, is the part the old records do not explain." Grace felt her knees weaken again, and this time it wasn't from the pull of the bond. It was simply the weight of being spoken about, like she wasn't fully in the room, like her whole life had just become a subject for a council meeting. She asked. All three of them turned to her at once, and for a moment, the attention was almost worse than being ignored. "I didn't ask for this," Grace said. "I was filling in for someone. I wasn't even supposed to be near the front of that hall." "We know," Gabriel said gently. "No offense meant," Nathan added, in a tone that suggested offense was the last thing on his mind, "but the bond does not care what you were supposed to be doing." Grace let out a breath that shook more than she wanted it to. "So what happens now?" Winifred looked between the two brothers, and something passed across her face, a kind of quiet, reluctant sympathy. "Now," she said, "the three of you learn to live inside a question no one in this kingdom has answered in living memory." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Outside the chamber, faintly, Grace could still hear the murmur of the crowd below. Hundreds of people trying to make sense of what they had witnessed, and failing, because the three people at the center of it were failing too. Gabriel was the one who finally broke the silence, his voice softer than Grace expected from a king. "Whatever this is," he said, looking at her, not at his brother, "we're not going to make it worse by rushing it." Nathan's eyes flicked to his brother, sharp and assessing, before returning to Grace. "Agreed. For now, she stays in the palace. Under guard, for her own safety, not as a prisoner." "I have a family," Grace said quickly. "A mother. She'll worry." "Word will be sent to her," Nathan said. "Tonight." Grace looked at the two of them, brothers who had ruled a kingdom together, their entire lives, standing on either side of her, like the balance between them had just cracked down an invisible seam. She didn't know their history. She didn't know their kingdom. She only knew that something ancient and unasked for had reached into her chest and split itself between two men who, until an hour ago, had never needed to compete for anything. "I don't want to be the reason you two stop being brothers," she said quietly. Neither of them answered right away. It was Winifred who spoke instead, her voice quiet but certain, the voice of someone who had read enough old, forgotten pages to know how these stories tended to end. "That," she said, "may not be entirely up to you." Grace looked at the door, at the narrow stairs leading back down to a hall full of people who had just watched her entire life change shape, and understood, with a cold and simple certainty, that whatever happened next, there would be no undoing what the fates had already done. The candle on the table between them flickered once, as if in agreement, and went still. 3 weeks passed, and Grace still hadn't gotten used to waking up inside the palace. Her room was larger than her family's entire cottage, with a window that looked out over gardens she wasn't sure she was allowed to walk in without permission. Every morning a servant named Ruth brought her breakfast in clean clothes, and every morning Grace thanked her too many times, unable to shake the feeling that she didn't belong in a room this quiet, this soft, this far from the life she used to know. The kingdom had settled, mostly, into an uneasy sort of patience. Winifred had announced, carefully and without much detail, that the split bond required a period of courtship before any decision could be made about the future. Nobody in the court seemed to fully believe that explanation, but nobody dared challenge it either, not with both kings standing united in front of the announcement, even if the unity felt thinner than it used to. What the court didn't know was that the two kings had agreed to something between themselves, quietly, in a room with no witnesses. They would each spend time with Grace. They would let her come to know them as men, not as crowns. And when she was ready, she would choose. Neither of them believed the arrangement would stay peaceful for long. Neither of them said that part out loud. Nathan's courtship, if it could be called that, began with silence. He arrived at her door the morning after the agreement was made, dressed simply, without the heavy ceremonial coat he wore for court. He didn't bring flowers or gifts. He brought a folder of papers. "I thought you might want to understand what you've walked into," he said, holding it out to her. Grace took it, surprised. Inside were maps of the kingdom, records of harvests, notes on trade agreements with neighboring territories. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't meant to be. "You're showing me your work," she said. "I'm showing you what I've built," Nathan corrected. "There's a difference." Over the following days, Grace learned that Nathan's version of courtship was an invitation into the machinery of his life. He took her to the treasury, where he explained, patiently and without condescension, how the kingdom's grain reserves worked. He brought her to war councils, seating her at the edge of the room, letting her watch how decisions were made that would never reach her ears if she were only a servant girl again. She noticed things about him. The way his left hand tapped twice against the table whenever he was about to say something he didn't fully believe. The way his voice dropped half a register when he was truly listening instead of simply waiting for his turn to speak. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it came slowly, like something being unlocked rather than given away. "Why are you showing me all this?" she asked him one evening after a council meeting that had run long into the night. "Because I don't know how else to be known," Nathan admitted. It was the most unguarded sentence she had heard from him yet. Gabriel's courtship looked nothing like his brother's. He didn't bring her papers. He brought her outside. The first time, he simply appeared at her door with 2 horses already saddled and said, "You've been inside this palace for 3 weeks. That's long enough." They rode past the palace walls, into open country Grace hadn't seen since she was a child, and Gabriel talked the entire way, easily, about everything and nothing, about the history of the old orchard they passed, about a border skirmish he'd handled the week before, about a joke one of his soldiers had told him that he clearly found funnier than it was. "You laugh a lot," Grace said, amused despite herself. "Somebody has to," Gabriel said. "My brother certainly won't." Where Nathan showed her his kingdom, Gabriel showed her himself. He taught her to hold a sword properly, correcting her grip with careful hands and an easy patience that never once made her feel foolish for not already knowing. He told her about the border wars he oversaw, the wolves under his command who trusted him with their lives, and there was pride in his voice when he spoke of them, pride without arrogance. "You never talk about ruling," Grace observed one afternoon as they sat on a hill overlooking the training fields. "Ruling is Nathan's gift," Gabriel said simply. "Mine is keeping people alive long enough to be ruled." Grace found herself laughing more around Gabriel than she had in years, and that frightened her almost as much as the bond itself did, because laughter was easy to fall into and hard to climb back out of. But there was a part of herself she kept hidden from both of them, a small locked room in her chest that neither Nathan's papers nor Gabriel's horses had touched. Before any of this, Before the bond, before the crown, there had been a boy named Peter. They had grown up 2 cottages apart, and by the time Grace turned 16, she had loved him the plain, uncomplicated way people love the first person who ever made them feel chosen. Peter had joined the Border Patrol 2 years ago, eager to make something of himself, eager to earn a life worth offering her. He never came home. Nobody in the palace knew about him. Grace had never told Ruth, never told Winifred, and certainly never told either king. It felt like a wound that belonged only to her, one she wasn't ready to hand over to strangers, even strangers who had somehow become the center of her entire future. There was an old chipped teacup in her room, left behind by whoever had lived there before her, and Grace found herself staring at it more often than made any sense. It had nothing to do with Peter, it had nothing to do with anyone, but her eyes went to it anyway, every time the grief rose up quiet and unannounced, and focusing on the crack along its handle gave her somewhere to put the feeling that had no other place to go. One evening, Gabriel found her sitting alone in the garden, staring at nothing in particular, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "You disappear sometimes," he said, sitting beside her without asking permission, which she had come to understand was simply how he moved through the world. "Even when you're right here." Grace didn't answer immediately. Everyone has a version of themselves nobody else has met yet. "That's fair," Gabriel said. He didn't push. He simply sat with her in the silence, and for once, silence with him didn't feel empty. A few nights later, Nathan asked her to walk with him along the palace wall, where the whole city spread out below them in scattered lantern light. "The court is starting to whisper," he said, without preamble. "They want to know which of us you favor." "I don't know the answer to that," Grace admitted. "Neither do I," Nathan said, and there was something almost raw in his voice, a crack in the careful control he wore like armor. "I've never had to want something my brother might also have. It's an uncomfortable education." Grace looked at him, surprised by the honesty. "Does it bother you, sharing this?" "Every day," Nathan said simply, "but bothering me has never stopped me from doing what's necessary." There was something in the way he said necessary that made Grace's stomach tighten, though she couldn't yet name why. The days blurred together after that, courtship layered over courtship, Nathan's quiet intensity, and Gabriel's easy warmth pulling at her in 2 directions that never quite resolved into one clear path. She caught herself comparing them, without meaning to, cataloging their differences, like a woman trying to survive a storm, by memorizing which direction the wind came from. She hadn't chosen yet. She wasn't sure she could. And underneath all of it, quietly, the memory of Peter sat like a stone at the bottom of a well, undisturbed, waiting for a moment neither king had yet earned the right to reach. One morning, a messenger arrived at the palace gates with news from the border, breathless and pale, and Grace watched both kings' expressions change at the exact same moment, the easy rhythm of courtship shattering instantly into something far more dangerous. "The Draven pack has crossed the eastern line," the messenger said. "They're testing the border defenses. They say they've heard about the split bond, and they intend to prove which king rules with a weaker claim." Nathan's jaw tightened. Gabriel's hand went instinctively to the hilt of his sword. Grace felt the pull in her chest twist, sharp and sudden, like the bond itself understood, before she did, that whatever came next would change everything. The War Council convened before noon, and for the first time since Grace arrived at the palace, she was not asked to sit at the edge of the room. She was told, gently but firmly, to stay behind. She refused. In the quiet, immovable way she was learning to refuse things that mattered, and Nathan, after a long look that weighed something she couldn't read, allowed her to stand near the back wall on the condition that she stayed silent. The map spread across the table showed the eastern border in careful detail, the Draven pack's territory marked in red ink that looked, to Grace, uncomfortably like a wound. "They've moved 3 units to the ridge above Hollow Creek," said one of the generals, a broad-shouldered man named Edmund. "If they cross the river, they'll reach the outer farms within 2 days." "They're not interested in the farms," Gabriel said, leaning over the map. They're interested in a story. A split bond means a split kingdom, in their eyes. They want to prove it by forcing one of us to fail publicly. Then don't give them the chance, Nathan said. Send the Western Guard to reinforce the ridge before they cross. The Western Guard answers to me, Gabriel said, an edge creeping into his voice that Grace hadn't heard from him before. I'll lead them myself. That's exactly what they want, Nathan said sharply. A visible target, a prince they can claim to have humbled. I am not a prince, Nathan. I am a king, same as you, and I will not sit inside these walls while my soldiers bleed on a ridge I know better than anyone in this room. The tension between them, usually buried under years of practiced partnership, rose to the surface fast and ugly, and Grace felt it in her chest, the bond twisting uncomfortably, as if it too were being asked to take sides. In the end, Gabriel won the argument, mostly because Nathan had no real authority to stop him, only worry disguised as strategy. Gabriel rode out that same evening with 200 soldiers, promising to return within the week. Grace stood at the palace gates as he left, and for a moment his easy humor returned, just enough to steady her. "Don't worry," he said, swinging onto his horse. "I've done this before. I'll be back before you even notice I'm gone." "I'll notice," Grace said quietly, and something flickered across his face before he turned and rode into the dark. The days that followed were the longest of Grace's life. Nathan withdrew into a version of himself she hadn't seen before, cold and precise, spending hours locked in the war room with maps and reports, emerging only to eat, and even then barely speaking. Grace tried, once, to ask him what was happening at the border, and he answered with numbers, troop counts and supply lines, nothing that told her whether his brother was safe. On the fourth day, a rider returned from the front with news that spread through the palace like fire through dry grass. The Draven pack had ambushed the Western Guard at Hollow Creek, timing their attack to strike exactly when Gabriel's forces crossed the narrowest, most exposed part of the ridge. Gabriel had been wounded, badly, holding the line long enough for his soldiers to retreat safely, and had nearly died doing it. Grace heard the news standing in the same hall where the bond had first split her heart in two, and this time the pull in her chest did something entirely new. It split clean down the middle again, but not evenly. Half of her felt raw, immediate agony, imagining Gabriel bleeding on a ridge 2 days' ride away. The other half turned cold, sharp, and focused entirely on Nathan, who stood a few feet away, receiving the same news with an expression that did not match the horror Grace expected. He wasn't surprised. It was small, almost invisible, the way his shoulders didn't tense the way everyone else's did, the way his eyes moved to the messenger with something closer to confirmation than shock. Grace had spent 3 weeks learning to read him, learning his tells, and this one, though subtle, was unmistakable. "You knew," she said, before she could stop herself. Nathan turned to her, and for the first time since she'd met him, something like guilt crossed his face before he could smooth it away. "I suspected the Draven pack would test whichever of us moved first. I didn't order Gabriel to go. But you knew they would target him, and you let him ride out anyway." "I couldn't stop him," Nathan said. "You were there. You heard the argument. You could have gone with him. Someone has to hold the kingdom together while the other one is in the field. That has always been how we work." Grace stared at him, and the cold half of her chest, the half that belonged, somehow, to whatever calculating instinct the bond had lent her, understood something she hated understanding. "You wanted to see if he could survive it alone," she said quietly. "You wanted proof." Nathan didn't deny it. That was the worst part. He simply looked at her, his jaw tight, and said nothing at all, and the silence confirmed everything Grace didn't want confirmed. She turned and walked away from him, out of the hall, past guards who didn't dare stop her, out into the cold evening air, and she didn't look back to see whether he followed. He didn't. Grace spent that night in the healer's wing, sitting beside a bed that wasn't Gabriel's yet, because he hadn't arrived, waiting for a return that felt like it would never come. When the wagon finally rolled through the gates 2 days later, carrying him home wrapped in bandages, pale from blood loss but alive. Grace was already at the door before anyone told her he had arrived. She sat with him through the worst of the fever that followed, changing cloths on his forehead, listening to him mutter half-sentences in his sleep about the ridge, about soldiers he'd lost, about names she didn't recognize but that clearly haunted him. Nathan came to the healer's wing exactly once during those first 2 days, standing in the doorway without entering, watching his brother's chest rise and fall like he was counting each breath to make sure it continued. "How is he?" he asked quietly. "Alive," Grace said, without looking at him. "No thanks to whatever you were testing." Nathan flinched, barely, but Grace saw it. "That's not fair, isn't it?" He didn't answer. He simply stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked away, and Grace let him go, because she had nothing left to say to him that wouldn't come out as something crueler than she meant. On the third night, Gabriel's fever finally broke. He woke slowly, blinking against the candlelight, confused for a moment about where he was, and then his eyes found Grace sitting beside him, and something in his face softened with relief. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Where else would I be?" He tried to sit up too fast, wincing at the pull of his bandaged side, and Grace put a hand on his shoulder to stop him, and for a moment neither of them moved, her hand simply resting there, the bond in her chest settling, finally, into something that felt less like a war and more like relief. "I heard Nathan didn't come with reinforcements," Gabriel said quietly, once he'd caught his breath. Grace hesitated. She hadn't planned to tell him what she suspected, not yet, not while he was still weak enough that the anger might do more harm than good. But something in his face, the quiet trust he'd offered her without asking anything in return, made the words come out anyway. "I don't think he stopped you because he couldn't," she said carefully. "I think he wanted to see what would happen if he didn't." Gabriel went very still. "Say that again," he said, his voice suddenly flat, in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Grace repeated it, watching his face change from confusion to something colder, something that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, uncomfortably like his brother. "He let them test me," Gabriel said slowly, as if turning the sentence over to check if it made sense from every angle. "He let the Draven pack nearly kill me, to see if the kingdom would survive without me." "I don't know his reasons," Grace said. "I only know what I saw on his face when the news came in." He wasn't surprised. Gabriel's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring at the ceiling of the healer's wing like it might offer him an answer his brother wouldn't. "We've never lied to each other," he said finally, quiet, almost to himself. "Not once, not in 30 years. Grace didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and simply stayed beside him as the candle burned low, the silence between them heavy with a betrayal neither of them had asked for, and neither of them knew yet how to survive. Outside the healer's wing, the kingdom carried on, unaware that the fragile balance between its two kings had just cracked in a way that no war council, no old record, and no fated bond could easily repair. Gabriel healed slowly, and the kingdom healed with him, though something underneath the surface never quite returned to what it had been before. He didn't confront Nathan right away. For nearly 2 weeks he said nothing, moving through council meetings and court appearances with the same easy humor the kingdom expected of him, and only Grace noticed how carefully that humor was constructed now, like a mask worn a half-second too long after the joke had ended. Nathan noticed too. He wasn't a man who missed things. "You're avoiding me," he said to his brother one evening, catching him alone in the palace library. "I'm healing," Gabriel said, not looking up from the book he wasn't actually reading. "You've been healed for a week." Gabriel finally set the book down and looked at his brother directly. "Grace told me what she saw on your face, the day the news came in about the ridge." Nathan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did, a stillness that Grace, watching from the doorway, recognized as the particular kind of silence a man wears when he's been caught at something he can't argue his way out of. "I didn't send the Draven pack after you," Nathan said. "No," Gabriel agreed. You just didn't stop me from walking into their trap, and you didn't seem surprised when I nearly didn't walk back out. The two brothers stared at each other across the library, and Grace, standing just outside the doorway, felt the full weight of the bond in her chest for the first time in days, pulling in two directions that no longer felt like courtship at all. It felt like watching a bridge slowly give way in the middle, board by board, and knowing there was nothing she could do to stop the water underneath from rising. I have spent our entire lives making the decisions no one else wanted to make, Nathan said finally, his voice low. Someone has to be willing to test what the kingdom can survive. I never wanted it to be you on that ridge, but I needed to know whether the kingdom could hold if it ever had to be. That's not leadership, Nathan. That's using me as a measurement. It's the same thing our father did to both of us, every day of our childhood, and you know it. The mention of their father hung in the air, heavy and unresolved, and for a moment Grace saw something pass between the brothers that had nothing to do with her at all, an old wound reopening beneath the new one. I'm done being measured, Gabriel said quietly. By you or by anyone. He walked out of the library without another word, and Nathan didn't follow him, standing instead with his hands braced against a table, his head bowed in a way Grace had never seen from him before. She didn't go to either of them that night. She went instead to the old chipped teacup in her room and sat with it, turning it slowly in her hands, letting the ache of Peter's memory rise up alongside the ache of watching two brothers she had somehow come to love, in different and equally consuming ways, come apart at a seam that had probably always been fraying. The following morning, Winifred summoned all three of them to the west chamber, the same round room where this had all begun. The old woman looked older than Grace remembered, tired in the particular way of someone who has spent weeks reading records nobody else was patient enough to search through. I have found something, Winifred said, without preamble. In the oldest histories of the split bond, it is not simply an accident of fate, nor a test of loyalty, it is a mechanism. Meaning what? Nathan asked. Meaning the bond, split between two claims, does not simply exist in balance forever. It draws from both sides, slowly, quietly, and from her most of all. Winifred looked at Grace with something close to sorrow. Every day this remains unresolved. It costs something, not just from you, child. From all three of you. Grace felt a chill move through her. She had noticed, in the past weeks, a tiredness that never quite lifted no matter how much she slept. A heaviness in her limbs she had assumed was simply grief or stress. She hadn't considered it might be something else entirely. The bond has to resolve, Winifred continued. One claim must release, fully, for the drain to stop. If it does not, all three of you will continue to weaken, slowly, until the fates decide the matter for you in a far crueler way than any of you would choose for yourselves. Silence settled over the room, heavier than any silence that had come before it. Release how? Gabriel asked. The claimant who steps back must do so completely, Winifred said. Not in name only. The bond does not respond to politics. It responds to truth. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between his brother and Grace, and then he did something that surprised everyone in the room, including, Grace suspected, himself. Then I'll be the one to release my claim, he said. Gabriel's head snapped toward him. What? I have spent my entire life making the difficult decision so that you didn't have to, Nathan said, his voice steady, though Grace could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. This is no different. The kingdom needs one of us fully devoted to ruling, and the other fully devoted to her. I know which role suits me better, and it is not the second one. You don't get to decide that for her, Gabriel said sharply. Or for me. I'm not deciding for her. I'm removing myself from a choice that is tearing all three of us apart, 1 degree at a time. That's not sacrifice, Nathan. That's control. You're doing the same thing you did on the ridge, deciding what's necessary without asking anyone whether they agree. The two brothers stared at each other, and for the first time since Grace had met them, she saw something close to true anger pass between them, Not the old easy friction of two men who ruled together, but something rawer, older, wounds that had clearly existed long before she ever walked into that coronation hall. "Stop," Grace said quietly. Neither of them stopped. "Stop," she said again, louder, and this time both of them turned to her, startled by the force in her voice. "You are both standing here deciding what happens to my heart, like it's a treaty to be negotiated," she said, her voice shaking now, though whether from anger or exhaustion she couldn't tell anymore. "Nathan, you don't get to release yourself like it's a strategic decision. And Gabriel, you don't get to be angry at him for trying to protect something, even if he's doing it badly, because that's exactly what you did on that ridge, and it nearly killed you." Both men fell silent. "I need time," Grace said, "not because I don't know my own heart, because I have spent weeks pretending my own grief doesn't exist so I could focus on surviving both of yours, and I am done pretending." She turned and walked out of the west chamber, down the narrow stairs, past guards who once again knew better than to stop her, and this time neither king followed. That, more than anything else that had happened in the west chamber, felt like the truth finally breaking the surface. Grace walked until she reached the garden where Gabriel had once found her staring at nothing, and she sat there now, alone, the old chipped teacup left behind in her room, and for the first time since Peter's death, she let herself say his name out loud, quietly, to no one, just to hear it exist, somewhere outside her own head. "Peter!" she whispered. The garden didn't answer, but something in her chest loosened slightly, like a door long jammed shut finally giving an inch. She stayed there until the sky darkened, and when she finally rose to return to her room, she realized, with a strange and heavy clarity, that whatever decision came next would not belong to either king. It would belong entirely to her, and to a grief she had carried alone for far too long, and to a truth she had not yet spoken to either man who claimed to want her whole heart. She intended to speak it soon. She simply hadn't decided, yet, to which one. Grace didn't return to the west chamber for 3 days. She spent that time in places neither king thought to look: the kitchens where Ruth worked, the small chapel near the eastern wall, the stables where the horses didn't ask her questions she wasn't ready to answer. She needed, more than anything, to hear her own thoughts, without either brother's voice layered over them. On the 4th morning, she asked Ruth to send word to both kings that she wished to speak with them, separately, not together, and not in the west chamber. Nathan came first, to the small chapel, standing stiffly near the door like he wasn't sure he belonged inside a room built for quiet things. "You asked to see me," he said. "I did." Grace sat on the wooden bench, and after a moment, he sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. "I need to tell you something I haven't told anyone here." "All right." Before the bond, before any of this, there was someone. His name was Peter. Her voice stayed steady, though it cost her something to keep it that way. "He died on the border, 2 years ago, in a skirmish that probably looked a lot like the one that nearly took your brother's life." Nathan didn't say anything right away. He simply listened, his eyes fixed on her, and Grace found she was grateful, in that moment, that he didn't rush to fill the silence with reassurance he hadn't earned. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and it sounded like he meant it. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand why what you did on the ridge frightened me more than anything else since the coronation," Grace said. "I have already lost someone to a decision made by people who thought the cost was worth the outcome. I can't live beside someone who makes that same calculation again, even with the kindest intentions." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "I have spent my whole life believing that someone has to be willing to make the hard choice, or nothing gets protected at all. I still believe that, but I am beginning to understand that being right about a kingdom does not make me right about a heart." "No," Grace agreed gently. "It doesn't. I release my claim," he said, and this time it didn't sound like strategy. It sounded like grief, quiet and real. "Not because Winifred says the bond demands it, because I think, somewhere in the last few weeks, I already knew you were choosing him, and I have simply been too proud to say it before you did." Grace felt tears rise, unexpected and unstoppable, and Nathan, for once, didn't try to fix the moment or explain it away. He simply sat beside her until the tears passed, and when he finally rose to leave, he paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think Peter would understand why you're still standing, even with a heart that's had to survive twice." He left before she could answer, and Grace sat alone in the chapel for a long while, letting the strange, complicated relief of that conversation settle into her bones. Gabriel arrived an hour later, and Grace told him everything, the same story, the same name, the same grief she had carried silently since long before the coronation. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without rushing her, his hand finding hers partway through and staying there. When she finished, he didn't offer sympathy shaped like pity. He simply said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." "I haven't told anyone," Grace admitted, "not even Ruth." "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," Gabriel said. "Whatever happens between us, I promise you that." Nathan released his claim, Grace said quietly. Gabriel's hand tightened slightly around hers, but he didn't look surprised. "I suspected he might. He's always been better at sacrifice than he lets anyone see." "Are you angry at him still?" "I don't know yet," Gabriel admitted. "I think that's a wound that will take longer to heal than the one on my side. But I don't think anger and love are as separate as people pretend they are, especially between brothers." Grace looked at him, at the easy honesty that had drawn her to him from the very first ride outside the palace walls, and understood, with quiet certainty, that this was the man who had never once tried to compete with a ghost he didn't know existed until an hour ago. He hadn't tried to prove himself bigger than Peter's memory. He had simply made room for it. "I choose you," she said, "not because Nathan stepped back, because every time my grief has surfaced these past weeks, you never once asked me to explain it before you sat with me in it." Gabriel didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he brought her hand to his lips, gently, and said, "I'm not going anywhere." The bond in her chest, which had lived for weeks as two competing currents pulling in opposite directions, settled at last into something singular, something whole, though not without a lingering ache where the other half had been. Some scars, Grace realized, didn't disappear simply because a choice had finally been made. They simply became part of the shape a person carried forward. The formal announcement came 3 weeks later, in the same hall where the split bond had first thrown the entire kingdom into confusion. Grace stood beside Gabriel this time, and Nathan stood a few steps away, his crown still on his head, his expression composed in the careful, practiced way of a man determined to give his brother a wedding day undisturbed by old wounds. The court, predictably, whispered. They always would. A kingdom with 2 kings and 1 queen was a strange enough arrangement that gossip would likely follow Grace for the rest of her life. She found, standing there, that she didn't mind as much as she once thought she would. Winifred approached her quietly before the ceremony began, studying her with the same careful attention she'd shown from the very first night. "The bond has settled," the old woman said. "You'll feel stronger within days. The drain will stop." "And Nathan?" Grace asked. "He will carry the mark of what he released for the rest of his life," Winifred said. "As will you. As will his brother. That is simply the cost of a split bond resolved. No one walks away from it whole in exactly the way they were before." Grace nodded, understanding, in a way she hadn't before, that the story didn't end with a clean resolution and a perfect happiness untouched by everything that came before it. It ended, instead, with 3 people learning to carry the shape of what they'd survived, together and separately, in the same kingdom, under the same sky. When the ceremony began, Grace reached for Gabriel's hand, and he took it without hesitation, his easy warmth steady against the ache that still lived quietly in her chest, where Nathan's claim had once been. Across the hall, Nathan watched, his expression unreadable to anyone who hadn't spent weeks learning to read it, and Grace, glancing his way just once, saw something there that looked, finally, like peace, hard-won and imperfect, but real. Outside the palace walls, the kingdom of Ashford carried on unaware that its balance had shifted forever, held now not by two matched crowns ruling in perfect symmetry, but by three people who had learned, the hard way, that love rarely arrives in the shape anyone expects, and that surviving it, whole or not, is sometimes the only victory worth having. Grace turned toward Gabriel as the court began to cheer, and for the first time since the candles had leaned toward her in that coronation hall weeks ago, she felt something settle inside her that had nothing left to fight against. It felt, at last, like home.